Hello. Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to begin this evening with an acknowledgement. The Department of Asian Languages and Literature acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land that we currently occupy and upon which we carry out our work of scholarship and teaching. As humanistic scholars, we recognize that a land acknowledgement is but one small act in the ongoing process of confronting difficult realities and of striving to place ourselves in a just relationship with the land, its historical occupants and stewards, and their descendants. Well, good evening and welcome to the 26th Andrew L. Markus Memorial Lecture. My name is Zev Handel. I'm the chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Literature, and I'm delighted to be with you on this lovely evening, arguably, in Seattle. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to say a few words about Andrew Markus, for whom this wonderful series of lectures is named and in whose memory it is carried forward. Andrew Lawrence Markus was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and educated as a child in American and European schools. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College in 1975 with a BA in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. After studying early modern Japanese literature at Keio University in Tokyo, Andrew Markus received his doctoral degree from Yale University in 1985 with a dissertation on the 19th century Japanese writer Ryūtei Tanehiko. After serving briefly on the faculty of the University of Kansas, he came to the University of Washington in 1986 and taught classical Japanese language, literature, and culture here in our Department of Asian Languages and Literature. He was promoted to the rank of associate professor with tenure in 1992, the same year that his monograph on Tanehiko, titled The Willow in Autumn, was published by the Harvard University Asia Center. A review of the book that appeared in the Journal of Japanese Studies said this: "Anyone with firsthand experience of the difficulty of the texts Markus discusses will find his expertise daunting." The review went on to say that the book will be a rich source of ideas for students of late Edo Japan for years to come. The time and effort Markus put into the book will pay off handsomely in intellectual dividends. Sadly, Professor Markus was unable to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing a generation of scholars and students benefit from his singular work of scholarship. He passed away in October of 1995. First with a symposium the following year, and then through this series of annual lectures held since 1998, with 1 year missed due to the COVID pandemic. The generosity of Andrew Markus's family and friends has permitted the department to remember him and to commemorate his legacy as a scholar and as a teacher by inviting leading researchers from around the world to speak on topics related to Asian languages, literatures, and cultures. On behalf of the department, I would like to express deep gratitude to Professor Markus's family and friends for making possible this very special annual event, which has, over a quarter century, truly become one of our department's most cherished traditions. And now, to introduce our distinguished speaker, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Nazri Bahrawi.
Thank you, Zev. I am honored to be introducing Professor Hendrik M.J. Maier, our first Southeast Asian Studies speaker for the Asian Languages and Literature Annual Markus Lecture Series. Hendrik, or Hank Maier, is Emeritus Professor of Literature of Southeast Asia and Indonesia at the University of California, Riverside, where he was also the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Southeast Asian Studies program known as CTRIP, that aims to develop new forms of engagement with Southeast Asia and its diaspora with a focus on text, ritual, and performances. Hank was trained in Leiden University in the Netherlands, where he was conferred his PhD in Indonesian in 1985, and later rose the ranks to be appointed the chair of Malay and Indonesian language and literature before moving to UC Riverside in 2003. To my mind, Hank embodies the very idea of the Trans-Pacific. He's an illustrious member of the academic study of Indonesian letters at both ends of the Pacific Ocean. In the US, he has held visiting professorships at Cornell, UCLA, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And in Indonesia, he has held the post of director of the Institute of Oral Literature in 2 locations, in Pekanbaru and in Tanjung Pinang, and was also the co-director of an intensive Dutch intensive Dutch courses at the University of Gajah Mada in Yogyakarta. Given Hank's active contributions to the discipline of Indonesian literary and cultural studies, it was not surprising for me to learn that Hank had been an interlocutor to some of the illustrious Southeast Asian instructors, scholars in our very own institution, the University of Washington. Under the leadership of Professor Laurie Sears, noted social and intellectual historian of Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asian Center at the Jackson School of International Studies had hosted Hank for a talk at least twice in our premises. In 2006, he delivered a talk titled Tales of Confusion and Delay, Rise and Demise of Indonesian Literature. And then in 2010, he held a seminar on the topic of Malay bookshelves in 1930. Later in 2018, Hank had also contributed a chapter to an edited volume on figures of criminality in Indonesia, Philippines, and colonial Vietnam, edited by Vince Raphael of UW, a leading scholar of Southeast Asian history and the Philippines. In it, Hank discussed the works of Pramodia Anantatur, a writer who is often cited as Southeast Asia best candidate for the Nobel Prize for Literature, an author who was politically detained by the Indonesian second president Suharto by his New Order regime for a decade on the island of Buru, where the author had actually finished his magnum opus, a series of 4 books collectively known as the Buru Quartet, first narrated orally to his fellow prisoners before he was actually given access to writing materials to write it all down and codify it. In that piece, Hank highlights the manners through which the New Order regime had castrated literary dissent in Indonesia during the 1970s and 80s, leading authors to question realism and strict moralism, and resorted instead to penned works of literary absurdism with nameless, faceless protagonists. Pramodia was a notable exception as he continued to release his realist works during this of socially engaged literature under the threat of censorship and ban. Vince describes Hank's contribution to this volume as, quote, deftly demystifying the rhetoric and practice of censorship in Indonesia, unquote. This article should be put into conversation with last year's Markus lecture topic on censorship and modern Chinese literature by Professor Michelle Hawkes. I myself had personally encountered Hank's scholarship through his 2004 book, We Are Playing Relatives, a survey of Malay writing, published by KITLV Press in Leiden, Netherlands. I was attending a talk on Malaysian politics at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and because I had some time to kill, just went to the bookshop there and prior to the talk, and I walked out with 2 books, one of which is Vladimir Braginsky's very thick book called The Heritage of Traditional Malay Literature, and the second book being Hank's book. Despite their very differing approaches, I appreciated how the 2 books complement each other, with Hank's work really driving home the idea that Malay and Indonesian literatures are intricately linked, what I would call sastra serumpun, or cognate literature. In We Are Playing Relatives, Hank had skillfully weaved Malay and Indonesian classical and modern works into a coherent narrative to propose, as reviewer Tony Day says, that the most effective way for a contemporary reader to read a piece of Malay literature is to play relative with the text and not to approach it as one's cultural other. It was this very idea or condition of kacokan or hybridity that defines Malayness. Hank's appeal to the sense of kacokan is one that might guide the future of Southeast Asian studies at the University of Washington. We are one of 7 federally funded national resource centers on Southeast Asia, and so far the only one to have tweaked its focus from Southeast Asian studies to the Center for Southeast Asia and its diasporas. This is to reflect the collective strengths of our faculty here and to respond to certain conceptual changes to the development of Southeast Asian studies in North America. At UW, our faculty research not just on Southeast Asians in Southeast Asia, but also Southeast Asians diasporic communities in America. We have seen the active participation in our field, not just from colleagues at the American Ethnic Studies Department, but also Southeast Asian student bodies here. Washington State is home to the third largest Cambodian community in the US and have a sizable number of CHAMs too. Singaporeans were recently reported to be the fastest growing Asian group in King County by the Seattle Times. So in terms of disciplinary changes, we have seen transnational concepts emerging from leading scholars in the field, such as Global Asia, an idea that has been conceptualized by the journal Verge's founding editors Tina Chen and Eric Hayot, as combining the contextual, largely materialist approach, you can call them place, of Asian studies with a concern for epistemological categories of race and citizenship, or in short, concept of Asian American studies. Hank's appeal to Kachukan challenges norms and also challenges the insistence on purity, and it seems so too does the concept of Global Asia when it comes to questioning disciplinary norms. The impact that Hank has on the study of Southeast Asian cultural studies is undeniable. Tony Day again describes him as, quote, one of the world's leading authorities on literature written in the Malay language, unquote. A phrase I think that could also be used to describe his mentor, the prolific Dutch scholar of Indonesian literature, the late R. Theo. Just as productively, Hang has published many other intriguing works on both Malay and Indonesian literature as an author or co-author. These include books such as Epic Adventures, Heroic Narrative in the Oral Performance Traditions of Four Continents in 2004, and in the Center of Authority, the Malay Hikayat Merong Mahawangsa in 1988. The trajectory of Hank's research seems set to continue in exciting new ways. At dinner yesterday, we joked that academia is the only job where the real work continues after retirement. Yeah. To this end, Hank is working on 3 monographs. A collaborative book on a Malay poem from Sri Lanka, where there is a small diasporic Malay community. A book on the Indonesian poet Khairil Anwar, parts of which he will explore with our student in a graduate seminar on Wednesday. And a book about Walter M. Gibson, an American ship captain who escaped the death penalty in the Dutch East Indies to become a Mormon and eventually the Prime Minister of Hawaii. Right. So interesting. Tonight, Hank will be delving into the intricacies of the Malay poetic form known as the pantun, a genre of verse that has existed for at least 500 years, but have only been inscribed into UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage in 2020. Aptly, his lecture is alliteratively titled Melayu Malay Mystery Miracle. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Hendrik Maier.
Thank you for your nice words, and thank you for coming. I'll keep my beginning short. I go straight to my talk. I only want to say thank you for coming, and I hope I can entertain you. If you get bored with it, I asked to distribute the paper, and you can try to read them and look at them. And I tell you, I'm talking about these things, and I'll use them as an illustration. I want to begin with Mr. Gibson, 1853. Gibson was a traveler, an adventurer, and it was shortly told. He came from England, lived in South Carolina for a while, bought a boat without knowing why, and made the trip to the Dutch Indies, to Sumatra, basically. And again, he really didn't know what he was doing. He just looked for adventure. And Gibson was, of course, arrested by the Dutch because they thought this American guy is not good. We cannot trust Americans. He was put in prison and somehow he escaped and so on and so on and so forth. He wrote a book about his adventures in Sumatra and in Batavia, in Jakarta, what's now Jakarta. And it's an interesting book because it's one of the first books, stories about daily life in Sumatra and in the Dutch Indies. And it's even more interesting for me because it turns out that Gibson tried to learn Malay. And that's my starting point here. And that starting point is linked with the work that Edward Markus did. When I read his book before I came here, and I realized, and keep that in your mind, that he was a very good example of a person who is working with texts. He was one of these philologists. And I want to talk about philology today and show you a little how interesting and how exciting philology is. The working with text, and I'll come back to that later. But I want to start with this quotation from Gibson's work. Gibson somehow ended up in Palembang on the east coast of Sumatra, and he met some people, of course, and he did not know who they were. Were they Malays? Were they Chinese? Were they Arabs? They were not Dutch, that's for sure, because the Dutch were very unkind to him. What he did was talk with the locals. And I don't know if you ever did that, have you ever thought about it, how strange that is, that very often these travel stories never tell you how these travelers talked with the local people. Usually, of course, they didn't know the language. And of course, there must have been translators, but Gibson didn't have them. Gibson did it himself, and Gibson talks about it. And I give you one quotation. Our discourse in Malay was a labored work of broken sentences and signs. I had a small blank book cut and lettered in which I had already a goodly vocabulary of words and sentences, gathered from the Balinese captain and everyone I had met with who knew anything of Malay, whom I had always pressed into the service of teaching me, and now, with vocabulary and pencil in hand, I talked with the Panjerang, the ruler, as I had with all I had met with in the East, learning more as I talked on. This is a good example of a field worker, somebody who tried to understand how Malay works, in this case Malay. It's interesting, of course, to think by yourself, how did he know it was Malay? And I come back to that later. That's one of the great puzzles of Gibson. What did he know when he wrote this story? Philology. Philology is a field, is a discipline, or whatever you want to call it, that is not very popular in the US as far as I know. I try to follow what's going on in the field of comparative literature, and philology was out for a long time, for one generation, in the end of the 20th century, and then it came back again with articles by people like Riverside, you probably know his name anyway, and Paul de Man, saying we have to come back to philology. And the interesting thing, of course, is that nobody knows what philology is. And that's I could give a talk about all the discussions about what do we mean by philology. It's the love for words and so on and so forth, of course, philology. But in the tradition of philology, which was maintained in Europe, it became a sort of a study of all the texts of Latin and Greek, Hebrew, and manuscripts, and trying to find the real text, the real work. And I want you to remember at least one name, Sheldon Pollock, a Sanskritist, because that's also somebody who calls himself a philologist, who published some very interesting books about philology in the beginning of the 21st century, in which he talks about Sanskrit, of course, but also about Chinese and about Japanese and all these philologies' study of texts. And he gives a definition of philology, and I want to talk a little about that definition. He says, philology is a discipline to make sense of texts. A discipline to make sense of texts. It is, on first sight, you think, oh, that's interesting, that makes sense. But of course, you can think every word, that's also something which happens in philology, every word has more meanings. Meanings change, words change. And you don't have to think of etymology, but in general, the meaning of words changes. And that makes it, for instance, very interesting to look how dictionary makers work. Dictionaries try to catch words. And starting with Mr. Johnson in the 18th century, who made the first English dictionary, said, I cannot catch it. I make it, but I know it doesn't mean this anymore. It's something else again. And that's so interesting for me, and I hope for you, that you have to realize that language is something that goes on, that flows on. And you step into language, and you say something in language, and then it goes on again, and it goes on again, and it goes on again. And you cannot try to, you can try, but it doesn't work, to freeze it, to rule it. And that's why you could say that the whole definition of philology as a discipline that doesn't work. You can say, I'm going to make rules for words, and I'm going to make rules for grammar. And you can do that, but as soon as you make them, you realize it's already over. The rule doesn't fit, and it goes on and on and on. You can try, but it doesn't work. You can say the same thing of to make sense. What does that mean, to make sense? If you think again about sense, sense is meaning, to give meaning, you can say. But sense, if you look in a dictionary, it also means something like emotions, about feelings, sentiment, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens to this definition of philology that's given by Pollock? And for me, it's so interesting to see we try again and again and again to make definitions of what is something, and as soon as you make these definitions, it's done. And then, of course, the most important word in this definition of philology is the word text. What is a text? And I'm not going to be very long about it, as long as you realize there's a difference between text and work. And please remember that if you ever read something about literature, about literature, that usually nowadays people think that work is something invisible, and that work is manifests itself in a text, in something material, something which is on paper. And then you read it and it goes. But there is something, you can say, for instance, there's the Bible, a very bad example, but there's a Bible, there's a work, and it has many manifestations. Those are the texts. And that's something very important for philologists, of course, that you think by yourself, what am I doing? How do I work with texts? And I want to illustrate how you can work with text in this short conversation in terms of these pantoons. And that's the interesting thing for me was from the start that pantoons are not written, were not written. Pantoons were talked. Pantoons were spoken. And only in the next phase, some of them were written down. With a huge effect, of course, because if you speak it and it's done, it's gone. And of course, when you write it, it's there. And then, of course, you read it and it's gone again, but it's still, there's something stable. And that was the fate, and that has been the fate of pantoon, too. Pantoon started, as far as we know, is also speculation, of course. Pantoon started as some oral, that horrible word, oral conversation. Somebody made some sort of a short poem. It was a pantoon poem, and then somebody else answered it, and so on and so on and so forth. I come back to that more focus later. There's another definition of philology, and that's by one of my favorite linguists, Roman Jakobson, beginning 20th century, Russian formalist. He said philology is very simple. Philology is reading slowly. And that's exactly what it is, basically, of course. You read slowly. You read a word, and you think about it. You read another word, and you think about it, and so on and so forth. And then you think about the syntax, slow, 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 slow. And you compare. And I hope you agree with me that reading slowly is very effective with poetry and not with prose. Prose is, I hope you agree with me, when you read a novel, you're not reading slowly. You roll fast, 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 you want to go, what happens? Do they find each other? Will they be happy in the end? And so on and so forth. And of course, sometimes you think, whoa, that's nicely said, but you go on, you go on, you go on. And poetry is something which you should read in a different way. You should read it slowly. So you could argue that philology is very well adapted to reading poetry in particular. Now, poetry is a very complicated word. And now we come into something which has to do with translation. In German, there's a word Dichtung. And Dichtung is usually translated as poetry. But Dichtung is not poetry, so to speak. Dichtung is fantasy. Dichtung is imagining things. And somehow, in all the theoretical discussions about philology and about texts and about poetry, that has very often been sort of put under the blanket, and put under the carpet. That when Americans and English people talk about poetry, try to remember that it's something else from the Dichtung in German. And why do I say that? Because in the last 5, 6, 7 years, I became very fascinated by a German philosopher, Heidegger, who made it very clear that he talks about Dichtung. He talks about slowly reading, fantasy, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, that has been translated too easily in English translations of Heidegger with poetry. And it gives all sorts of problems about what we are doing when we read poetry and when we read slowly. Jakobson also has something to say about what's the function of reading slowly. And of course, you can think of it yourself. It can be fun. It's fun to read slowly and let your thoughts go over a word, and you think about what does that mean, where does it go, and so on and so forth. Another thing Roman Jakobson said, it's so interesting, when you read, for instance, Russian, in his case, of course, Russian poetry, you talk or you listen to the dead, to the people who are gone, people who are no more there. And it's very stimulating and very inspiring to think there's a history. This writing has a history. This writing was made, this work, mind you, not the text necessarily, of course. This work was made by somebody a long time ago, was written down a long time ago, was listened to a long time ago. And of course, poetry, in whatever sense, is something that you think about life. And I hope you agree with me. Of course, there are people who or poets who try to sort of neutralize that. But I hope that you agree with me that if you read poetry, you have an attitude of, oh, this is about the world. This is about how I should live or how I could live, alternatives, and so on and so forth. And that's a very important point. And I'll come back to that later, but try to remember that's a very important point for Heidegger, that if you read poetry, you realize there's another world, there's another life. Poetry projects things. And it doesn't matter if that's German poetry, he talks about Hölderlin and some others, but it also applies to pantoons, for instance. It also applies to Wordsworth and Whitman, and all these famous poets. When you read them, and when you read them slowly, you start to think about the world. Very important. Connected to that is, of course, that poetry, and language in general, of course, it gives information. It gives information about the world. It gives information about, it represents something, but there's also something else. And Heidegger calls it magic, mystery. That's why I gave the title to the talk. There's something mysterious about poetry. It has an aura of something scary, something strange. Good poetry, and of course you can measure poetry in all sorts of ways. And maybe the most important thing is, and that's what you can see on the paper I'd asked to distribute, is philology is a very good way, reading poetry is a very good way to think about translation and about language. If I ask you to translate some English into whatever language in Indonesian or something Indonesian, pantoons for instance, into English, and each of you will do it in a different way. And of course, philology is very interested in the question, why is that? How come? What's going on in the minds of these people? More importantly, what's going on in language? And then you get this whole discussion, and I don't want to talk too much about it, but what is language? Very shortly you can say, of course we speak languages, but you can think about the possibility that it is the other way around. Language speaks us. We walk into language. It's a sort of a metaphor, but I still like it very much. Why can we talk? Because we already know language, which means language comes to us. I hope that all of you now and then have this feeling that you don't know what you're saying, that you are sort of carried away, carried along by something forceful that you don't understand. And now and then when I'm talking now here, I even have it now, that I think something is going on in my mind or whatever. I receive something, I listen to something, and I talk to something. That's why there's this whole philosophy, and again I refer to Heidegger if you want to think a little more about it, that says we are victims of language. We just transmit language, we just transfer language. We receive it, we hear it somehow, and you can have all sorts of neurological explanations for it, but it's still, for me, a mystery. How come? How come that we now and then we talk without knowing that we talk? How come we understand without knowing that we understand? How come we communicate and we don't know where it comes from? It can make you nervous. It can make you very that you don't have control over language. And of course, the reaction in particular in the 19th century was, we should get control over language, the rise of linguistics. We should be able to organize language, words. We should be able to make a grammar. We should be able to make a dictionary. There's all sorts of complications there. In the first, of course, you have to realize that grammars and dictionaries were made in writing. As far as we know, there's no oral transmission of grammar in oral form. And maybe that's, you can think of all sorts of reasons, but it's, and again, it's another story. But you have a voice, you have sound, you have all sorts of gestures, which are part of language. And again, you don't know why this voice is like this, and how does that work with the voice, and why do certain words touch my voice, and I speak them, I pronounce them. That's the mystery of language, and I hope, anyway, I am often very scared about language, that I don't understand what's going on. And that's probably one of the reasons that somebody like Roman Jakobson talks so much about it. The translation is, of course, the most important way to realize what is going on in language. What are we doing here? How do I now talk Russian, and now I talk Indonesian? How does that work? We try to learn it. And learning, as soon as you start learning, it's a thing of making sense and making grammar. Keep there. Now, language is language as such, language in general. And of course, you know, we have this idea, there are all sorts of languages. I think, how was it again? I think they say, for instance, a good example, in Indonesia, there are 700 languages. Now, what does that mean, 700 languages? It means, basically, that somebody started to give names to certain sentences, to certain words. Let's call this Bugis. Let's call this Toba. Let's call this Javanese, and so on and so forth. Who did that? I would almost say, of course, the colonials, the colonizers. Why did they do that? Because they wanted to have order. They heard all these languages around them, all these words and all these sentences, and they couldn't make sense of them, so to speak. And they tried to organize them. So you have these wonderful meetings of Dutch people in particular. Missionaries are a very famous example of that, who talk with locals and say, what language do you speak? And of course, these locals don't understand it. I speak, period. And then, of course, you had this thing, no, you speak something. And then, of course, okay, well, if you want me to speak something, then I speak Javanese or whatever. And so gradually in the Dutch Indies, and think about it, it happens also in Siberia and in the US and wherever you go, that you get these languages. One of these languages was Malay. And Malay is one of the most puzzling languages maybe in the world, and in any way in Indonesia. Try to remember that language is something political. Language is something ideological. We want to have order. We want to make sure that people speak in a certain way and that we can make sense of it. Philological work, basically. In the 19th century, language, for all sorts of reasons, and maybe you have heard of the name Herder. Well, again, this is all European stuff. He said, well, there are nations who speak a language and they live in a certain area. That was the principle. And the principle is very interesting if you think about it, because it assumed that people were basically monolingual. They had one language. And of course, nowadays we say that's nonsense in Indonesia and also in Europe. People spoke several languages in terms of languages as we spoke. They didn't know that they spoke Swedish and Finnish, for instance, or that they spoke here in Indonesia, that they spoke Javanese and Balinese or whatever. They spoke. This whole idea of categorization and of ordering is something which was imposed by the Dutch, by the colonizing powers. Malay is so complicated because nobody knows what Malay is, as if we know what Javanese are, and as if we know who Sundanese are. But Malays were even more complicated because the Dutch merchants and the Dutch administration people who traveled around in Southeast Asia heard the same words here and there everywhere. And they thought, this must be Malay. This is Malay. And that's also what happened to Gibson. Gibson travels and he hears the same words again and again and again, in between all the other languages, all the other words, of course. And then he says, okay, these are the Malays. Where did he hear that? Where did the Dutch and outsiders hear it? They heard it all the way from Sumatra to Irian Jaya. They were everywhere Malay-speaking people. And then, of course, automatically, these foreigners, these outsiders said, oh, then there are Malays. So you have this whole idea of Orang Melayu, Malays, who traveled all over, wandering around in Southeast Asia, and in particular, of course, the islands, Nusantara, but in also Malaysia, who spoke this language, and they must have been, or must be, one ethnicity, the Malays, which they weren't, because they also spoke other languages, non-Malay languages, so to speak. Somehow, and of course, that's another long story, at the end of the 19th century, the Dutch colonizers, the Dutch administration, the Dutch people who tried to make Southeast Asia, anyway, Dutch Indies into a nation, they said, let's try to introduce and impose Malay everywhere. The question was, of course, what Malay are we talking about? Because you can imagine, just like here in the US, the English which is spoken in Boston is different from the English spoken in LA or Louisiana or whatever. And of course, it was the same with the Dutch Indies, that there was some Malay, but there was so much variation, so many variants. And then you get this question, if we are going to make books, if we're going to translate the Bible, which variant of Malay are we going to use? What they did was, in retrospect, they thought by themselves, we are going to use a Malay which is written down, which we can find in manuscripts. And we are going to make a Malay that is used in writing by the courts, by the kings, by the clerks of the kings, and so on and so forth. And we call it High Malay. We call it very standard. That's the standard. That's going to be the standard. And when these linguists and these philologists started to travel around in Southeast Asia and sat in their chair in Leiden in particular, they looked at these manuscripts and they said, okay, we're going to make a grammar based on writing, on Malay writing. And it's in retrospect, of course, it's a very strange idea. And then the next step was, of course, where are we going to find these writings? And lo and behold, they found them in Riau, in the area between Singapore and Sumatra, on the western side of the Nusantara. Were they Malays? No, the people living there. But they had their kings, their rulers, wrote Malay manuscripts. And that's what we are going to make into Malay, the High Malay. And that's the basis of the national language of Indonesia and the basis of the national language in Malaysia. And that's a very complicated issue because Malaysia was done by the British, Indonesia was done by the Dutch, and of course they had a different policy, but they both thought by themselves, we make this Malay the most important language in Southeast Asia. What did they base themselves on? On these written manuscripts. High Malay, so to speak. Was this the Malay that Gibson heard? Probably not. Because what Gibson heard was vernacular, was dialect, a variant. And little did he know about this whole distinction between real Malay and or standard Malay or whatever. He just wrote down what he heard, what the voice told him. But very short afterwards, he made these notes, and then he got interested, and that shows again how European he was, and how Western he was. He said, maybe poetry is the most interesting way to understand a language, to make sense of a language. And what he did was, he made notes about the poetry he heard around him in Palembang, which happens to be an area which is now called Malay. He made notes, and you can find it in the book again. I can give a quotation, but you just have to believe me. He listened to girls, to women who said poetry, who sang poetry, pantuns, these pantuns, which I will talk about later, and wrote them down, translated them, saying, well, it was complicated to translate them. I didn't understand exactly what it said, but this is what it is. And Gibson deserves name that he was the first how would I say that? The first person who published a poem in Malay. And he had it printed in Batavia, and of course it was banned by the Dutch. Little did they know that it was by Gibson, but they simply didn't like the idea that Malay was printed at that time. But that's another story. But the interesting thing is that Gibson is one of these philologists in the beginning who got interested in poetry, in pantuns in particular, because he realized that's what poetry is in Malay. And what is a pantun? I'll come back to that later. I want to be a little personal. When I started my studies in Leiden, my teachers were all these old-fashioned philologists, and even worse, old colonials. They were used to think about language in a certain way, and that way was philologically. So when I came there and I said, I want to study Malay, I want to know Malay, whatever that means. When do you know Malay? They said, okay, come. And what my teacher did, he gave me us 2 weeks of grammar. And then he gave me these poems that you see, these pantuns. He said, that's the best way to learn Malay. Why is that the best way? Because it's the high Malay. It's the Malay which was written by the nobility and so on and so forth. It's also very philological in the sense that you see the Dutch translation next to it. That, of course, what did I know? I was like Gibson. I got some words and I had a dictionary, and the professor said right away, okay, now you read it and you try to make sense of it. And of course I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't understand it at all. But that's the aim. That was the aim. And that's the aim of philologists. You approach texts with the attitude of, I don't understand what it is about, and I'm going to try to understand it. Now, the main message of pantuns, again, in retrospect, has been that we don't understand what it is about, the good pantuns. We don't understand what is being said there. And the rest of my story will be the struggle of philologists to read pantuns and to try to understand, and now I'll come back again to Sheldon Pollock's idea and to Jacobson's idea. Read carefully, try to understand them, and you don't, and try to make sense of them. In discipline is maybe a bad word. Maybe you should just say attempt. You try to make sense of them, but it doesn't work. And in retrospect, you can say the good pantun. You can see some of them in the text. Are the texts you don't understand? Now, what is the meaning of pantun? Where does it go to? And then the locals, the people who make these pantoons, very often say, it's because of the sounds. It sounds good. Have an experience for yourself. And there we come back to Heidegger, who says, well, if you read something very carefully, words open up. Words mean things that you don't think about before. Words can be very liberating, different from reading a novel in which you just hobble on and you think, okay, la 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 la. With poetry and pantoon, you struggle word for word and you enjoy it, you experience it, it's an event, and that's something which you can find with comparative literature people very often. Poetry is an experience. A poem is not a thing, a poem is not an object, a poem is something which you should experience, which, like language, it moves. You read it again and it's different, and you read it again, it's different, and so on and so forth. And that's the liberating thing of pantoon. Again, back to Jacobson. I don't want to be too theoretical, but it's important to see that Jacobson came from a school of thinking which had this very famous term, defamiliarization. You make something unfamiliar. And that's exactly what happens in these pantoons. If you read the one that has been translated into English, you can see it, the Marston one, for instance. You see something which became sort of a conventional analysis of pantoons in general by foreigners, and probably explained to them by these locals, that you see two couplets, two times two sentences. And the first two sentences, the two first lines are something very abstract, something very cosmic almost. And the second couplet, the second two lines, are something more concrete, about something the poet felt, for instance. That's the principle of defamiliarization. When you read these texts, Jacobson would agree with me, I hope, that when you read these little pantoons, you realize there's something strange going on in these texts. It doesn't read like prose, it doesn't read like information, it feels like something I have to experience, I have to think about. And perhaps most importantly, does it refer to something in the world, something concrete? No, it does not. And that's still the essence of a good pantoon, that you think by yourself and you read it and you reread it and you think about it and you reread it and you answer another pantoon, that you have the feeling this is something unfamiliar. And that means that from that moment on, and then I jump again to what later people said, that means that you start to think about the world in a different way. It sounds very radical, but it's very important, and I hope probably some of you must have had the same feeling with other, not pantoon, poetry, that if you think about poems, you should, that's at least the idea, you should be able to think by yourself, never thought about this before. And you can make that more radical, and that's what Heidegger does, and you don't have to be too radical, but you can say by yourself, I never thought about this before. This changes my position in the world, this changes my position in life. And that's the aim of pantoon, probably. I mean, it's all an idea. It shouldn't surprise you that from the start in the Dutch Indies, foreigners were very much interested in pantoons. Like Gibson, right? He wrote them down, and he thought about them, and he explains them, and he does all sorts of things with them, and he keeps on saying, well, this is so strange. I don't think about the world in the same way anymore. Things changed. And that started not only with Gibson, But already before that, Marsden is a very famous one. He wrote the history of Sumatra. Everything you want to know about Sumatra, you can find in Marsden, 1790 or something. And after him, people like Raffles, you probably know his name anyway, and Crawford. I mean, all these people who studied Southeast Asia and worked in Southeast Asia, administered Southeast Asia, they were fascinated by these pantoons. Why? Because they couldn't get a grip on them. They didn't understand them. And of course, there are lots of pantoons. There's a lot of bad poetry, and there are a lot of bad pantoons, of course. But the ones they chose, and you can find quotations, I chose one, the Marsden one, but for instance, Crawford and Raffles, they have pantoons that they say, well, I don't know what it means. But different from Gibson, who stays there and says, well, okay, I don't understand them and I like them. People like the other kind of philologists, people like Raffles and John Leyden is another one, they wanted to understand them. They wanted to get a grip on them. They wanted to comprehend them, literally comprehend. They want to have them. Why can't I understand them? I should understand them. So they had this attitude of, this is what it means. And that attitude was taken over by the Dutch. The Dutch and the British scholars and administrators were, of course, very competitive. And basically, the British, let's face it, were smarter than the Dutch, probably. They were all philologists in a way. And the Dutch said, okay, that must mean something. I have an explanation for it, and I'm not going to tire you with all sorts of Dutch explanations. Interesting thing, of course, is that the most important explanations came from people who were professors in Leiden, in Holland, where I was a professor. And it's very strange to think about these predecessors, that they had these ideas about pantoons and so on and so forth, talking about tradition, for instance. What did the Dutch do? The Dutch also said, okay, these pantoons are interesting. We do not yet understand them, but we think they're folklore. And of course, they have all these folklore studies, and I don't want to go too much into that. But what they did was, let's collect them. And from 1870 onwards, in the Dutch Indies, there were these collections of pantoons. And here the philology comes in again. And maybe you can compare it what happens in China, what happens in Japan. I don't know how that works. The strange thing of pantoon, the presentation of pantoons, of collections of pantoon, is that you don't know where they're from. You don't know who made them. When were they made? And of course, philologically speaking, that's very interesting, very strange. What does that mean? Where does that come from? Wasn't that interesting? And of course, again, I just signal it, and you have to think for yourself for all sorts of reasons. It's important to think about them because these pantoon collections were used in schools, in the educational systems, pantoons in Malay. And children, students who learned, who were Javanese speakers, who were Balinese speakers, who were Toba Batak speakers, when they went to school, they had to learn these Malay pantoons. And I'm sure that some of them must have said, so where are they from? And very often we don't know. They're just floating around. And that's the imagery which is very often used when people talk about pantoons. Pantoons wandered around in Southeast Asia. And that's too simple. I mean, of course, we have this idea, a poem should have a writer. A poem should have a composer. A poem should have a maker. But of course, it's sort of colonial to think, well, that's not so interesting, that's not important who made it, because the community made it. It's folklore, it's shared by everyone, and they all knew it, and so on and so forth. And of course, in retrospect, that's something which is very disturbing. You even cannot, and that's the next thing, of course, is that these collections of pantoons were printed in this new standard Malay that nobody spoke. And you can be sure that these pantuns were originally spoken in some dialect, some vernacular, but they were transformed into this very strange, sort of stylized, what we nowadays call classical Malay. It's sort of a standard Malay in the beginning of the 20th century. These collections were not only anonymous, and so on and so forth, and we don't know where they're from and so on. They were given an introduction by Dutch teachers, by Dutch students of Pantun. And of course, you can imagine that you don't have to be politically correct, but it's very strange how they talked about them. And basically what it says is that, you're a little stupid, but let's start with something which was a long time ago. And that's, of course, the idea. These are very old pantuns. They're old poetry. And you get this whole feeling of nostalgia. You get this whole feeling of far away, long time ago, and so on and so forth. Whereas, probably, there were lots of pantuns still being used, still being spoken, still being exchanged in daily life. So you have this whole bizarre idea about the Pantun collections, and I gave you some examples of it, which I learned when I started to learn Malay. And I was told, hey, this is Indonesian, basically. But it was a Malay that I couldn't place, and I didn't think about it at the time. But nowadays, I think it's just so bizarre to have these very strange poetries, poems, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look through these collections, you don't know where they come from. You don't know when they were said for the first time, for the last time, probably. And yet, of course, we try to find a development in them, an evolution in the Pantun. And that's the final thing I want to talk about a little, that you can, if you study Pantun, you see very often this tendency to think, first of all, that you say, well, Pantuns are very old. We think they already were common in 1200. And of course, that's nonsense. We don't know. Let alone, you talk about these Pantuns in these collections. What do we know about what happened 700 years ago? And there again, philology is very interesting and very badly used in this case. That of course people imitate each other. Somebody said, oh, they're all 1200, 1300, maybe 1321, who knows? And of course, that's nonsense. But that became accepted. The scary thing was not only that the Dutch imitated them, but also the locals. They also said, well, Pantun is very old, and it's very folkloristic, and it's very countryside, country bumpkin type stuff, and we don't do that anymore. It's just sort of a heritage idea. And that's what is scary and which is interesting, and you can think by yourself, so how does that work out? Pantun became sort of the national form of poetry in Malaysia. And again, that's a very complicated story that Malaysia has been very, the government anyway, has been very Malay. There are Chinese, there are Indians, there are foreigners, and so on and so forth. But Malay nation, Malay culture, Malay literature, Malay poetry should be pushed. We should have one language instead of the Chinese and the Indians and so on and so forth. We should have one kind of poetry, and Pantuns are perfect for that. They're deep, they're very hard to understand, they're beautiful, they have beautiful sounds. You learn it at school. A different story, of course, in Indonesia. In Indonesia, Malay, thanks to the Dutch basically, Malay became the national language. Malay became the national language for everyone, meaning, and it's very dangerous to predict, but it seems that gradually everybody in Indonesia knows Malay. What kind of Malay? That's another story. We call that Indonesian. Don't call it Bahasa Indonesia. That's a very strange term for me. Just call it Indonesian. But if you think about it, Indonesian is a form of Malay. And that particular form of Malay, Indonesian, is the language that you see on that flyer, on the thing that you distribute. That's official Indonesian, and let's face it, it's Malay. They share it with the Malaysians. Now, now we get into politics, and I mean, there's lots more to say, and maybe you have some questions, but the thing is this. You had these collections of pantuns, which are collected, the pantuns are collected as a sort of a nameless, placeless, authorless, floating mass of beautiful phrases telling you about pre-Hindu. That's a horrible step too, and pre-Islam. All these very strange ideas. The basis for the Malay nation. And there's this complicated thing which the local people took over from the colonizers, that we talk about a nation, we talk about a place, we talk about a time. The Malay nation, which never existed, of course, if you think about it. But it was made. And that's a very good example, again, of an invention of tradition that you think by yourself, it's nonsense what they say. And if you go to Malaysia, if you go to Indonesia, and you ask, are you a Javanese, are you a Batak, or whatever, and they'll say, I'm an Indonesian. And of course, are they? Yeah, because I speak Indonesian. But does that make them Indonesians? That's a question of nationality and nationalism. And the Indonesian government, in particular in the Suharto era, has been very good in pushing that onto the population. You are Indonesian. Forget about the Javanese thing. You may be a little Javanese sort of as a second language, but Indonesian, that's the thing you have to learn. And pantuns are a very good example. You learn it at school, you can play with it, and that's of course the fun thing of pantuns and of poetry in general, that think of yourself when you're a kid, you like to experiment with language, and you like to experiment with all sorts of playful things in the language. And that's something which is fascinating in Indonesia, all this going on with the language of Indonesian. Very important, of course, is in this whole thing, is that somehow nobody knows what pantuns were. Nobody knows what pantuns are. But they were told, we were told, I was told, that a pantun consists of 4 lines, a break between the second and the third line, something cosmic, something nature, something animals or something, and something about personal feelings. That's what a pantun is. Now, if you look at even on written materials, pantuns are much more. There are pantuns that are 8 lines, 16 lines, 32 lines. Pantun berkait. There are pantuns of 6 lines, and so on and so forth. But there's this idea that the real pantun, the true pantun, the pure pantun, and then we go back again to 1300, is this pantun that I just described. Malay is the language of Malaysia and of Indonesia. And in particular, since the Suharto days, since 65, 66, there have been all these efforts to unify Malay. In spelling, of course, but also in terms of literature, that Indonesian literature was exported to Malaysia and the other way around. It was not always successful, but there is this idea that there is this Malay foundation, this Malay fount, this Malay bottom, so to speak. And that's how around 1925, the concept of ala Melayu came up. The Malay world, the Malay cosmos, the Malay nature, basically. And what does that mean? There was this dream of this single nation with a single language, Malay, that covered all the way from Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, the south of the Philippines, and Indonesia, all the way to Irian Jaya, to New Guinea. That's the ala Melayu. We are together. We belong together. That's a political statement. It's a cultural statement. It's also a sort of an identity statement that you think by yourself, okay, we share something. And of course, it doesn't make sense if you look at it. And it didn't work. But it's an interesting experiment to see, like you can, in a way, of course, it has been compared to what happened in Europe, that you get one huge country, the whole of Europe, under one language, all together, the Alam Europa, so to speak. Alam means some cosmos, world, and you get all these very interesting comparison again with Heidegger, with the world and the Eerde and so on. Pantun played an important role in this. And that's why it shouldn't surprise you that it's very, I think, well, I'm sorry, I'm an outsider, but I think it's silly anyway, that they tried to make the Pantun sort of the national poem of Southeast Asia. And how do you do that? Very post-colonial, or maybe even colonial. You go to the United Nations. And you ask to the United Nations, please, could you make this our national heritage? And that's what happened. And I know it from close by. I know the people who went to Paris and had these conversations at UNESCO about the Pantun. What do we need to prove that we have this shared heritage? And so they came up with all these scholarly arguments, but also with poetic arguments. And they showed, look here, there are these publications by a very famous, maybe some of you know, Muhammad Haji Saleh, a very good friend of mine, who wrote all these publications about the Pantun everywhere. I go to Irian Jaya, I go to Timor, I go to Sulawesi, I go to Dayak land, I go to Toba, everywhere Pantun. And he records them and he prints them. And lo and behold, they're all in this standard Malay, in this, what we now call Indonesian. It's standard Malay. Nobody spoke that way. Nobody performed them in that way. But hey, that's the way it is. That's the heritage. And that's so interesting for philologists, of course, that you see how a certain genre is treated and is developed and is judged. And I go back again to the beginning. The Sheldon Pollock has been very clear how philology works. He says you can study the beginning of a text, which means the beginning of a work. You can follow the transmission of that work until the present day. And you look back from the present day to what happened with this work in the past. And that's a very good example that I try to do with this Pantun, that I'm talking in 2023, 24, and I see the Pantun is now a heritage thing, very flaky and very fake, but hey, that's the way it works. And I can see how it developed from all these interventions by Marsden and all these people, and people from Leiden, very important, and I feel guilty, I'm sorry. And then at the beginning, there was nobody. It was pure. And it's all fiction. And people accept it. And people think it's wonderful. And that's the force of language. And again, then we come back to the language. If you think about this talk in the future, just try to realize how strange language is. how wonderful language is, and how strange it is that you do not know where it comes from and where it goes to. You take hold of it for a moment, and then it goes again. I don't express my heart, I express language. And I know that because the language comes from somewhere else. Is it local? Is it wandering around? Is it in time? I don't know. And that's the mystery and the magic of language. And Pantun is a very good example of how that works in poetry. It wanders around. It changes shape. Every Pantun is a work which finds a manifestation in a text. And where does it end? Where does it begin? We don't know. And that's the magic and the mystery of language. Thank you.